We were admonished by this to lose no time in seeking the next proposed object of our search, the Langrenus, or number 26, which is almost within the verge of the libration in longitude, and of which for this reason Dr. Herschel entertained some singular expectations. After a short delay in advancing the observatory upon the levers and in regulating the lens, we found our object and surveyed it. It was a dark, narrow lake 70 miles long, bounded on the east, north, and west by red mountains of the same characters as those surrounding the Valley of the Unicorn, from which it is distant to the southwest about 160 miles. This lake, like that valley, opens to the south upon a plain not more than 10 miles wide, which is here encircled by a truly magnificent amphitheater of the loftiest order of lunar hills. For a semicircle of 6 miles, these hills are riven from their brow to their base as perpendicularly as the outer walls of the Colosseum at Rome, but here exhibiting the sublime altitude of at least 2,000 feet in one smooth, unbroken surface. How nature disposed of the huge mass which she thus prodigally carved out, I know not, but certain it is that there are no fragments of it left upon the plain, which is a declivity without a single prominence except a billowy tract of woodland that runs in many a wild vagary of breadth and course to the margin of the lake. The tremendous height and expansion of this perpendicular mountain, with its bright crimson front, contrasted with the fringe of forest on its brow, and the verdure of the open plain beneath, filled our canvas with a landscape unsurpassed in unique grandeur by any we had beheld. Our 25 miles perspective included this remarkable mountain, the plain, a part of the lake, and the last graduated summits of the range of hills by which the latter is nearly surrounded. We ardently wished that all the world could view a scene so strangely grand, and our pulse beat high with the hope of one exhibiting it to our countrymen in some part of our native land. But we were at length compelled to destroy our picture as a whole for the purpose of magnifying its parts for scientific inspection. Our plain was, of course, immediately covered with the ruby front of this mighty amphitheater, its tall figures, leaping cascades, rugged caverns, as its almost interminable sweep was measured off upon the canvas. We frequently saw long lines of some yellow metal hanging from the crevices of the horizontal strata in wild network or straight pendant branches. We, of course, concluded that this was virgin gold, and we had no assay master to prove to the contrary. On searching the plain over which we had observed the woods roving in all the shapes of clouds in the sky, we were again delighted with the discovery of animals. The first observed was a quadruped with an amazingly long neck, head like a sheep, bearing 2 long spiral horns, white as polished ivory, and standing in perpendicular parallel to each other. Its body was like that of a deer, but its forelegs were most disproportionately long, and its tail, which was very bushy and of a snowy whiteness, curled high over its rump, and hung 2 or 3 feet by its side. Its colors were bright bay and white in brindled patches, clearly defined but of no regular form. It was found only in pairs in spaces between the woods, and we had no opportunity of witnessing its speed or habits. But a few minutes only elapsed before 3 specimens of another animal appeared, so well known to us all that we fairly laughed at the recognition of so familiar an acquaintance in so distant a land. They were neither more nor less than 3 good large sheep, which would not have disgraced the farms of Leicestershire or the shambles of Leadenhall Market. With the utmost scrutiny, we could find no mark of distinction between those between these and those of our native soil. They had not even the appendage over the eyes, which I have described as common to lunar quadrupeds. Presently, they appeared in great numbers, and on reducing the lenses, we found them in flocks over a great part of the valley. I need not say how desirous we were of finding shepherds to these flocks, and even a man with blue apron and rolled up sleeves would have been a welcome sight to us, if not to the sheep. But they fed in peace, lords of their own pastures, without either protector or destroyer in human shape. We at length approached the level opening to the lake, where the valley narrows to a mile in width and displays scenery on both sides picturesque and romantic beyond the powers of a prose description. Imagination borne on the wings of poetry could alone gather similes to portray the wild sublimity of this landscape, where dark behemoth crags stood over the brows of lofty precipices, as if a rampart in the sky, and forests seemed suspended in midair. On the eastern side there was one soaring crag crested with trees, which hung over in a curve like three-fourths of a Gothic arch, and being of a rich crimson color, its effect was most strange upon minds unaccustomed to the association of such grandeur with such beauty. But whilst gazing upon them in a perspective of about half a mile, we were thrilled with astonishment to perceive four successive flocks of large winged creatures, wholly unlike any kind of birds, descend with a slow, even motion from the cliffs on the western side, and alight upon the plain. They were first noticed by Dr. Herschel, who exclaimed, "Now, gentlemen, my theory is against your proofs, which you have often found a pretty even bet. We have here something worth looking at." I was confident that if ever we found beings in human shape, it would be in this longitude, and that they would be provided by their Creator with some extraordinary powers of locomotion. First exchanged for my number D, this lens, being soon introduced, gave us a fine half-mile distance, and we counted 3 parties of these creatures of 12, 9, and 15 each, walking erect towards a small wood near the base of the eastern precipices. Certainly they were like human beings, for their wings had now disappeared, and their attitude in walking was both erect and dignified. Having observed them at this distance for some minutes, we introduced lens HZ, which brought them to the apparent proximity of 80 yards, the highest clear magnitude we possessed until the latter end of March, when we effected an improvement in the gas burners. About half of the first party had passed beyond our canvas, but of all the others we had a perfectly distinct and deliberate view. They averaged 4 feet in height, were covered except on the face with short and glossy copper-colored hair, and had wings composed of a thin membrane, without hair, lying snugly upon their backs from the top of the shoulders to the calves of the legs. The face, which was of a yellowish flesh color, was a slight improvement upon that of the large orange outang, being more open and intelligent in its expression, and having a much greater expansion of forehead. The mouth, however, was very prominent, though somewhat relieved by a thick beard upon the lower jaw, and by lips far more human than those of any species of the Simia genus. In general symmetry of body and limbs, they were infinitely superior to the orang-outang, so much so that, but for their long wings, Lieutenant Drummond said they would look as well on a parade ground as some of the old Cockney militia. The hair on the head was a darker color than that of the body, closely curled, but apparently not woolly, and arranged in 2 curious semicircles over the temples of the forehead. Their feet could only be seen as they were alternately lifted in walking, but from what we could see of them in so transient a view, they appeared thin and very protuberant at the heel. Whilst passing across the canvas, and whenever we afterwards saw them, these creatures were evidently engaged in conversation. Their gesticulation, more particularly the varied action of their hands and arms, appeared impassioned and emphatic. We hence inferred that they were rational beings, and although not perhaps of so high an order as others, which we discovered the next month on the shores of the Bay of Rainbows, that they were capable of producing works of art and contrivance. The next view we obtained of them was still more favorable. It was on the borders of a little lake or expanded stream, which we then for the first time perceived running down the valley to a large lake and having on its eastern margin a small wood. Some of these creatures had crossed this water and were lying like spread eagles on the skirts of the wood. We could then perceive that they possessed wings of great expansion and were similar in structure to those of the bat, being a semi-transparent membrane expanded in curvilineal divisions by means of straight radii, united at the back by the dorsal integuments. But what astonished us very much was the circumstance of this membrane being continued from the shoulders to the legs, united all the way down, though gradually decreasing in width. The wings seemed completely under the command of volition, for those of the creatures whom we saw bathing in the water spread them instantly to their full width, waved them as ducks do theirs to shake off the water, and then as instantly closed them again in a compact form. Our further observation of the habits of these creatures, who were of both sexes, led to results so very remarkable that I prefer they should first be laid before the public in Dr. Herschel's own work, where I have reason to know they are fully and faithfully stated, however incredulously they may be received. The three families then almost simultaneously spread their wings and were lost in the dark confines of the canvas before we had time to breathe from our paralyzing astonishment. We scientifically denominated them the Vespertilio homo, or man-bat, and they are doubtless innocent and happy creatures, notwithstanding that some of their amusements would but ill comport with our terrestrial notions of decorum. The valley itself we called the Ruby Coliseum in compliment to its stupendous southern boundary. The 6-mile sweep of precipices, 2,000 feet high, and the night, or rather morning, being far advanced, we postponed our tour to Petavius number 20 until another opportunity. We have, of course, faithfully obeyed Dr. Grant's private injunction to omit those highly curious passages in his correspondence, which he wished us to suppress, although we do not perceive the force of the reason assigned for it. It is true the omitted paragraphs contain facts which would be wholly incredible to readers who do not carefully examine the principles and capacity of the instrument with which these marvelous discoveries have been made. But so will nearly all of those which he has kindly permitted us to publish, and it was for this reason that we considered the explicit description which we have given of the telescope so important a preliminary. From these, however, and other prohibited passages, which will be published by Dr. Herschel, with the certificates of the civil and military authorities of the colony, and of several Episcopal, Wesleyan, and other ministers who, in the month of March last, were permitted, under stipulation of temporary secrecy, to visit the observatory and become eyewitnesses of the wonders which they were requested to attest. We are confident his forthcoming volumes will be at once the most sublime in science and the most intense in general interest that ever issued from the press. The night of the 14th displayed the moon in her mean libration or full, but the somewhat humid state of the atmosphere being for several hours less favorable to a minute inspection than to a general survey of her surface, they were chiefly devoted to the latter purpose, but shortly after midnight the last veil of mist was dissipated, and the sky being as lucid as on the former evenings, the attention of the astronomers was arrested by the remarkable outlines of the spot marked Tycho number 18 in Blunt's lunar crater. And in this region, they added treasures of human knowledge, which angels might well desire to win. many parts of the following extract will remain forever in the chronicles of time. The surface of the moon, when viewed in her libration, even with telescopes of very limited power, exhibits 3 oceans of vast breadth and circumference, independently of 7 large collections of water, which may be denominated seas, of inferior waters discoverable by the higher classes of instruments and usually called lakes. The number is so great that no attempt has yet been made to count them. Indeed, such a task would be almost equal to that of enumerating the annular mountains which are found upon every part of her surface. Whether composed of land or water, the largest of the 3 oceans occupies a considerable portion of the hemisphere between the line of her northern axis and that of her eastern equator, and even extends many degrees south of the latter. Throughout its eastern boundary, it so closely approaches that of the lunar sphere as to leave in many places merely a fringe of illuminated mountains, which are here therefore strongly contradistinguished from the dark and shadowy aspect of the great deep. But peninsulas, promontories, capes, and islands, and 1,000 other terrestrial figures, for which we can find no names in the poverty of our geographical nomenclature, are found expanding, sallying forth, or glowing in insular independence through all the billowy boundlessness of this magnificent ocean. One of the most remarkable of these is a promontory without a name, I believe, in the lunar charts, which starts from an island district denominated Copernicus by the old astronomers, and abounding, as we eventually discovered, with great natural curiosities. This promontory is indeed most singular. Its northern extremity is shaped much like an imperial crown, having a swelling bow, divided and tied down in its center by a band of hills, which is united with its forehead, band, or base. The 2 open spaces formed by this division are 2 lakes, each 80 miles wide, and at the foot of these, divided from them by the band of hills last mentioned, is another lake, larger than the 2 put together and nearly perfectly square. This one is followed after another hilly division by a lake of an irregular form, and this one yet again by 2 narrow ones divided longitudinally, which are attenuated northward to the mainland. Thus, this skeleton promontory of mountain ranges runs 396 miles into the ocean, with 6 capacious lakes enclosed within its stony ribs. Blunt's excellent lunar chart gives this great work of nature with wonderful fidelity, and I think you might accompany my description with an engraving from it, much to your reader's satisfaction. See Plate 4. Next to this, the most remarkable formation in this ocean is a strikingly brilliant annular mountain of immense altitude and circumference, standing 330 miles ESE, commonly known as Aristarchus number 12, and marked in the charts as a large mountain with a great cavity in its center. That cavity is now, as it was probably wont to be in ancient ages, a volcanic crater, awfully rivaling our Mounts Etna and Vesuvius in the most terrible epochs of their reign. Unfavorable as the state of the atmosphere was to close examination, we could easily mark its illumination of the water over a circuit of 60 miles. If we had before retained any doubt of the power of lunar volcanoes to throw fragments of their craters so far beyond the moon's attraction that they would necessarily gravitate to this earth and thus account for the multitude of massive aerolites which have fallen and been found upon our surface, the view which we had of Aristarchus would have set our skepticism forever at rest. This mountain, however, though standing 300 miles in the ocean, is not absolutely insular, for it is connected with the mainland by 4 chains of mountains which branch from it as a common center. The next great ocean is situated on the western side of the meridian line, divided nearly in the midst by the line of the equator, and is about 900 miles in north and south extent. It is marked C in the catalog and was fancifully called the Mare Tranquillitatis. It is rather two large seas than one ocean, for it is narrowed just under the equator by a strait not more than 100 miles wide. Only three annular islands of a large size and quite detached from its shores are to be found within it, though several sublime volcanoes exist on its northern boundary. One of the most stupendous of which is within 120 miles of Mare Nectaris, before mentioned. Immediately contiguous to this second great ocean and separated from it only by a concatenation of dislocated continents and islands is the third, marked D and known as the Mare Serenitatis. It is nearly square, being about 330 miles in length and width, but it has one most extraordinary peculiarity, which is a perfectly straight ridge of hills, certainly not more than 5 miles wide, which starts in a direct line from its southern to its northern shore, dividing it exactly in the midst. This singular ridge is perfectly sui generis, being altogether unlike any mountain chain either on this earth or on the moon itself. It is so very keen that its great concentration of the solar light renders it visible to small telescopes, but its character is so strikingly peculiar that we could not resist the temptation to depart from our predetermined adherence to a general survey and examine it particularly. Our lens, GX, brought it within the small distance of 800 yards, and its whole width of 4 or 5 miles snugly within that of our canvas. Nothing that we had hitherto seen more highly excited our astonishment. Believe it or not, it was one entire crystallization. Its edge throughout its whole length of 340 miles is an acute angle of solid quartz crystal, brilliant as a piece of Derbyshire spar just brought from a mine, and containing scarcely a fracture or a chasm from end to end. What a prodigious influence must our 13 times larger globe have exercised upon this satellite, when an embryo in the womb of time, the passive subject of chemical affinity, we found that wonder and astonishment as excited by objects in this distant world were but modes and attributes of ignorance, which should give place to elevated expectations and to reverential confidence in the illimitable power of the Creator. The dark expanse of waters to the south of the first great ocean has often been considered a fourth, but we found it to be merely a sea of the first class, entirely surrounded by land and much more encumbered with promontories and islands than it has been exhibited in any lunar chart. One of its promontories runs from the vicinity of Patatas, number 19, in a slightly curved and very narrow line to Buliodus, number 22, which is merely a circular head to it, 264 miles from its starting place. This is another mountainous ring, a marine volcano nearly burnt out and slumbering upon its cinders. But Pitatus, standing upon a bold cape of the southern shore, is apparently exulting in the might and majesty of its fires. The atmosphere being now quite free from vapor, we introduced the magnifiers to examine a large bright circle of hills, which sweep close beside the western abutments of this flaming mountain. The hills were either of snow-white marble or semi-transparent crystal. We could not distinguish which, and they bounded another of those lovely green valleys, which, however monotonous in my descriptions, are of a paradisiacal beauty and fertility, and like primitive Eden in the bliss of their inhabitants. Dr. Herschel here again predicated another of his sagacious theories. He said the proximity of the flaming mountain Buliodus must be so great a local convenience to dwellers in this valley during the long periodical absence of solar light as to render it a place of populous resort for the inhabitants of all the adjacent regions, more especially as its bulwarks of hills afforded an infallible security against any volcanic eruption that could occur. We therefore applied our full power to explore it, and rich indeed was our reward. The very first object in this valley that appeared upon our canvas was a magnificent work of art. It was a temple, a fane of devotion or of science, which, when consecrated to the Creator, is devotion of the loftiest order. For it exhibits his attributes purely free from the masquerade attire and blasphemous caricature of controversial creeds, and has the seal and signature of his own hand to sanction its aspirations. It was an equitriangular temple built of polished sapphire or of some resplendent blue stone, which like it displayed a myriad points of golden light twinkling and scintillating in the sunbeams. Our canvas, though 50 feet in diameter, was too limited to receive more than a sixth part of it at one view, and the first part that appeared was near the center of one of its sides, being 3 square columns 6 feet in diameter at its base, and gently tapering to a height of 70 feet. The intercolumniations were each 12 feet. We instantly reduced our magnitude so as to embrace the whole structure in one view, and then indeed it was most beautiful. The roof was composed of some yellow metal and divided into 3 compartments, which were not triangular planes inclining to the center, but subdivided, curved, and separated so as to present a mass of violently agitated flames rising from a common source of conflagration and terminating in wildly waving points. This design was too manifest and too skillfully executed to be mistaken for a single moment. Through a few openings in these metallic flames, we perceived a large sphere of a darker kind of metal, nearly of a clouded copper color, which they enclosed and seemingly raged around, as if hieroglyphically consuming it. This was the roof, but upon each of the 3 corners there was a small sphere of apparently the same metal as the large center one, and these rested upon a kind of cornice quite new in any order of architecture with which we are acquainted, but nevertheless exceedingly graceful and impressive. It was like a half-open scroll swelling off boldly from the roof and hanging far over the walls in several convolutions. It was of the same metal as the flames, and on each side of the building it was open at both ends. The columns, 6 on each side, were simply plain shafts without capitals or pedestals or any description of ornament, nor was any perceived in other parts of the edifice. It was open on each side and seemed to contain neither seats, altars, nor offerings, but it was a light and airy structure, nearly 100 feet high from its white glistening floor to its glowing roof. And it stood upon a round green eminence on the eastern side of the valley. We afterwards, however, discovered 2 others, which were in every respect facsimiles of this one, but in neither did we perceive any visitants besides flocks of wild doves which alighted upon its lustrous pinnacles. Had the devotees of these temples gone the way of all living, or were the latter merely historical monuments? What did the ingenious builders mean by the globe surrounded by flames? Did they by this record any past calamity of their world, or predict any future one of ours? I by no means despair of ultimately solving not only these, but 1,000 other questions which present themselves respecting the objects in this planet, for not the millionth part of her surface has yet been explored, and we have been more desirous of collecting the greatest possible number of new facts than of indulging in speculative theories, however seductive to the imagination. But we had not far to seek for inhabitants of this vale of the Triads, immediately on the outer border of the wood which surrounded at the distance of half a mile the eminence of which the first of these temples stood. We saw several detached assemblies of beings whom we instantly recognized to be of the same species as our winged friends of the Ruby Coliseum near the Lake Lagrinus. Having adjusted the instrument for a minute examination, we found that nearly all the individuals in these groups were of a larger stature than the former specimens, less dark in color, and in every respect an improved variety of the race. They were chiefly engaged in eating a large yellow fruit like a gourd, sections of which they divided with their fingers and ate with rather uncouth voracity, throwing away the rind. A small red fruit shaped like a cucumber, which we had often seen pendant from trees, having a broad dark leaf, was also lying in heaps in the center of several of the festive groups. But the only use they appeared to make of it was sucking its juice. After rolling it between the palms of their hands and nibbling off an end, they seemed eminently happy and even polite. For we saw in many instances individuals sitting nearest these piles of fruit select the largest and brightest specimens and throw them archwise across the circle to some opposite friend or associate who had extracted the nutriment from those scattered around him, and which were frequently not a few. While thus engaged in their rural banquets or in social converse, they were always seated with their knees flat upon the turf, and their feet brought evenly together in the form of a triangle. And for some mysterious reason or other, this figure seemed to be a special favorite among them, for we found that every group or social circle arranged itself in this shape before it dispersed, which was generally done at the signal of an individual who stepped into the center and brought his hands over his head in an acute angle. At this signal, each member of the company extended his arms forward so as to form an acute horizontal angle with the extremity of his fingers. But this was not the only proof we had that they were creatures of order and subordination. We had no opportunity of seeing them actually engaged in any work of industry or art, and so far as we could judge, they spent their happy hours in collecting various fruits in the woods, in eating, flying, bathing, and loitering upon the summits of precipices. But although evidently the highest order of animals in the rich valley, they were not its only occupants. Most of the other animals which we had discovered elsewhere in very distant regions were collected here, and also at least 8 or 9 new species of quadrupeds. The most attractive of these was a tall white stag with a lofty, spreading antlers, black as ebony. We several times saw this elegant creature trot up to the seated parties of the semi-human beings I have described and browse the herbage close beside them, without the least manifestation of fear on its part or notice on theirs. The universal state of amity among all classes of lunar creatures and the apparent absence of every carnivorous or ferocious species gave us the most refined pleasure and doubly endeared to us this lovely nocturnal companion of our larger but less favored world. Ever again, when I eye the blue vault and bless the useful light, shall I recall the scenes of beauty, grandeur, and felicity I have beheld upon her surface, not as though a glass darkly, but face to face, and never shall I think of that line of our thrice noble poet. Meek Diana's crest sails through the azure air, an island of the blest, without exulting in my knowledge of its truth.